Oh my. Let's try this again. Welcome back to the channel. Uh, Second attempt. Let's talk about Breonna Taylor. Let's talk about the settlement that the city of Louisville has agreed to with the family of Breonna Taylor. I have a clip, and I want to talk about whether or not this is actual justice, because obviously the calls for justice were typically people referring to like the officers involved being arrested. For those who are not super familiar with this case, this is a quick video. It's just going to run you through the settlement, what was agreed to, the financial payout, and ultimately a comment from the family, which really begs the question, is justice being served in this particular case? So let's run it. And if my sound is gone, let me know, please.
After months of nationwide protests and her name becoming a rallying cry for social justice, tonight Breonna Taylor's family has agreed to a $12 million civil settlement with the city of Louisville, one of the largest payments ever in the U.S. following a police shooting.
My administration is not waiting to move ahead with needed reforms to prevent a tragedy like this from ever happening again.
The settlement does not admit any wrongdoing by the police, but it includes several reforms, such as changes to the approval process for search warrants, the hiring of social workers to go out on mental health calls, and incentives for officers to live and volunteer in the community. The settlement comes more than 6 months after a botched raid at Taylor's apartment. Police were executing a search warrant looking for drugs. Officers said they announced themselves, but Taylor's boyfriend, who was also inside, disputes that. He wounded an officer when he says he fired his licensed weapon, fearing an intruder. Police returned fire, killing Taylor. Her family says no drugs were found in the apartment.
Breonna Taylor was in her apartment, who had every right to sleep in peace and not have the police execute a dangerous, I believe, unconstitutional and unjustifiable no-knock warrant on yet another black citizen in America.
One of the officers there that night, Brent Hankinson, was fired. The police chief wrote in his termination letter that Hankinson displayed an extreme indifference to the value of human life. Hankinson has not commented. 2 other officers are on administrative leave. None of the officers has been criminally charged.
What will you miss most about her?
Her smile.
Tamika Palmer is Taylor's mother.
How important are charges for these officers?
It's very important. It's the most important part of this at all. I understand that they're police officers, but that doesn't make you above the law.
Sources close to the matter tell NBC News that the Breonna Taylor case could be presented to a grand jury as early as this week. But Kentucky's Attorney General says there is no official timetable for when any potential charges would be announced. Hey, NBC.
So that is where we are. That is the settlement that was agreed to. Of course, they're going to start off with admitting no wrongdoing. Of course, that means a lot in cases where it might make it difficult for them to actually seek criminal charges against these officers if those cases are going to move forward. So I wouldn't really expect much to change. But the question really is this justice, right? When you see people out in the streets and they're protesting and they're rioting and burning things down, is justice for them getting a payment from the municipality or an insurance company in some cases? And I would originally argue, no, that's not really justice. But, you know, if nothing that we've learned over the last few months, the only thing, I think we all knew this, but it was just it's now blatantly being told to us. The only thing that really matters in this country is money. And when we have the government avoiding paying out these fees in some cases through using private insurance companies, well, that affects private businesses, and as a result of private business, miraculously, you see reforms being made simply to appease these private insurers, because they're simply not going to maintain. They're not going to continue covering these municipalities, these cities, because they can't afford to. It's bad business. So there's a couple of things I want to go through real quick. I want to talk. Can you please stop? Thank you. So let's talk about liability insurance, right? Typically, big cities pay for police claims and other claims from their central coffers, which are large enough to be able to settle. So, cities, New York, Chicago, LA, the big ones, they can afford to just pay this. I mean, it's not a little bit of money. We're talking $700 million in the case of New York City is being allocated for settling of cases, which is kind of absurd, I guess, but who knows? Maybe it's just par for the course. But of course, that's not just paying for officer-involved shootings. I mean, we're talking about car crashes, which surprisingly makes up a lot of this money. Car crashes, old cases where there was some type of corruption. It took a while for those things to get settled out. So there's a lot of pieces going on with that. But then you have these big cases where they're paying out $10 million, $5 million, $6 million. So it can get pretty expensive. But when you have these private insurers involved, then they're like, wait a minute, we're not going to continue covering you. So you're going to have to make changes to your criminal justice practices. Otherwise, we're not going to continue to be able to maintain you guys on our insurance. So whether provided by large insurance companies such as Travelers Insurance or Genesis or by specialized insurers, these policies work in a way that is pretty similar to auto insurance policies. Cities pay a premium, and the insurance pays out a claim once it's settled. So obviously, the more misconduct claims, the higher the premiums go. But when they're no longer enough to offset the insurance payout, the insurer may decide to withdraw from that market, leaving the city to fend for itself. And ultimately, many people don't respond to these things. They don't think this is a big deal. And I hear people saying things like, the officers have to be allowed to do their job. And I 100% agree. They should be allowed to do their job. But when you have policies like qualified immunity, which does essentially make officers above the law, it makes it hard for them to be held liable for situations like this. And these costs are then passed on to the taxpayer. So whether or not you want to have massive criminal justice reform, it doesn't matter because you're paying for it one way or another. So you can take those funds and we can find some other way. I'm not necessarily saying defund the police, but matter of fact, let's go back here. Because I want to talk about this. They did a great. Some people say it's not good enough, but I think this is a pretty good start. First of all, of course, they admit no liability in they admit no guilt regarding Breonna Taylor's killing, but they also talked about changes to the approval process for search warrants. It's probably going to be a big deal, but I think this is probably a more unique circumstance. The hiring of social workers to go on mental health calls, and this is a really big one, I think, because we've seen multiple cases, especially recently, where there have been officer-involved shootings with mental health professionals. And while I don't necessarily think I think there's definitely a time and place for that, but I think mental issues they're just difficult. They're going to be difficult, and you're going to have accidents. You know what I mean? We're going to have a lot more accidents in those situations. But they're proposing the opportunity for mental health professionals to be brought in. So we're going to see how that actually plays out. Is this going to resolve more situations? Are these mental health professionals going to be in danger, and now the police have to protect them? We'll find out because Louisville isn't the biggest place. Sure, buddy. Yes, sir. Yes, I'm talking to you, sir. All right. Yeah. So you're welcome. All right. He's taking advantage. He knows I'm recording, so he comes in to ask me for things now. So, yeah, I think this is going to be an opportunity for us to see how this is going to play out. And I don't know if this is going to be the best case. In my video yesterday, we showed the footage from, I think, this is Ricardo Munoz, who was a knife-wielding person, a mentally ill person who I guess was off his medication, came at the officer, and the officer shot him. That's a case where a mental health professional would have been a liability. So it's going to be really interesting, but there is things that we need to be doing differently than what we're doing currently. So they said that, okay, so this is a powerful mechanism. Incentives for officers to live and volunteer in the community. I think that's a really big one as well. We often complain that people who are policing the communities aren't really of the community, which makes them, they don't really have that connection. They're showing up to strangers' homes. They don't really know the people. And it creates a scenario where they feel like an occupying force, if you will. So I think this is a good incentive. I think these are good measures. But these measures really only come from the financial implications of not having them in place. $12 million is a pretty motivating thing to a small city. So let's talk about let's talk about what these premiums look like, right? So the city of Madison, Wisconsin, insurance costs have risen by more than 42% over the last 3 years after the city agreed to or has been ordered to pay nearly $13 million in 2 settlements and a jury award in 3 fatal police shootings. So in 2016, they were paying $736,000, and by 2017, they're paying 1.5 million. So, I mean, these costs can go up pretty significantly. And again, when we're talking about small cities, this can be a really, these are damning like fees. Like this is a pretty big deal. But I want to talk about police body cams, because this is where things can get interesting. Because there's been more scrutiny on police, and because this body cam footage has become more available, in some cases, it is causing municipalities to to settle even more quickly than they would prior to this. And I think this is where we kind of start to see the potential downfall of using financial damages to incentivize municipalities to make changes regarding, criminal justice procedure. In April, so I think this is from earlier this year. In less than 2 weeks after a news helicopter captured a video of a sheriff's deputy in San Bernardino, California, kicking and beating Francis Pusak, the county reached a $650,000 settlement with him. Pusak had been trying to escape from the deputies on a horse that he allegedly stole. He hadn't filed a lawsuit at the time of the settlement and still faces charges. But the attorney said that they simply wanted to settle this case fast. They talk about Laquan McDonald. A 17-year-old lunged at an officer with a knife. Lawyers for his family said they obtained a video from the police dashboard camera, and it shows an officer shooting the teen 16 times. He walked away, and that family settled for $5 million. Just more and more cases like this where, cities are simply saying, you know what, because this footage is available, we don't even want to take this to court. We don't want to deal with the potential. It's a nightmare as far as PR. You got this stuff all over the news, this footage leaks, and then you have people, this is years ago. This is before people were actually taken to the streets. Now you have riots. So things can get pretty bad. And that's why you would see communities not want to actually go far and say, we're going to actually make mandatory body cameras. Like they'll provide federal funding. That's probably what, the Biden administration would do, is provide federal funding for them. But since they can't make these municipalities wear body cameras, larger cities, they can probably handle it because they have money that they can set aside for payouts and things like that. But the smaller cities, they can't handle that. So they're going to be less likely to want to put body cameras on and make them mandatory. And I think that creates a really that takes a really bad turn, where if officers know that they have qualified immunity, they can't be held personally liable for these charges. Now, let me ask this. I know people are like, well, officers should be able to do their job, but imagine if officers had to be held financially liable for situations like this, where this wasn't falling back on the city. I think that would obviously be more of an incentive for officers to, at least try a little bit harder. But at the same time, this is going to provide financial relief for these communities in some regards. I mean, I'm sure there will be cases where maybe it'll be split, but putting some of that burden on the officers, I think it does say a lot. It does set a precedence, and I think it mitigates some of the risks that these insurance companies have to bear, and it provides some relief for the actual communities. But whether or not you agree with criminal justice reform or the way policing is happening today, it's ultimately going to affect you one way or another, because when it comes down to finance, the finances are of the city. They're not of a specific community or of a specific group. This is everybody. If you live in that city, this is going to affect you. Of course, in the Breonna Taylor case, the mayor and police chief said there was no footage of the raids because they were not required to wear body cameras. But if you actually see, it did appear that at least one of the officers had a body camera on. It just wasn't on, but they're not required to wear them. So there's that whole thing. But it's bad, man. It's really, it's just a bad scenario. This whole thing is awful. But like I said, if you don't, whether or not you feel, passionate about changing this system as it exists, it ultimately affects you, because whether or not these civil penalties fall on the officer, they're going to fall back on the community. So if they can't get the money out of the officer, then they're going to get it out of your community, and then that money that could have been going to your schools, or could have been going to fix your roads, or some other more beneficial part of your community, you're paying. So you pay one way or another. While this is not the justice that you would typically want to have, I think in America this is probably the best justice you really can ever get, because only when these things become so financially devastating are you ever going to see any real change. You go back to this case here in Wisconsin. There was a case of in Idaho, there was a case of police brutality, and in order to address it, the insurance company is going to the city and having them make a bunch of changes in the jail, having a nurse or medical personnel medical personnel available, extended it to all 44 counties of the Idaho statewide pool, and conditioned the low premiums on making these changes. The insurer gave them a couple years to meet requirements, with the understanding that if they didn't, their premiums would go up. The vast majority of counties involved made the changes. So if you can't make changes the right way, through legislation, through lobbying, then they'll be made by force through the financial devastation caused by these lawsuits. Because with the advent of body cameras and new technology that will come out ultimately to make it easier, so we can make sure we know what officers are doing, and whether or not all municipalities participate, many will. It will ultimately, because the beautiful thing about insurance companies as a private company, as a institution who's looking to make money, they're going to make sure they're tracking every single metric tied to this, and they're going to want to make sure they can manage their risk. And if it doesn't seem like a good financial model for them, they're going to pull out. And once they pull out, these municipalities will be left to fend for themselves. And see, the crazy thing is, when that happens, that's when the officers are going to say, you know what, we have to protect the community one way or another. So we may have made a mistake or two, but now we're going to have to start covering things up. And what's going to happen is it's going to be on a massive level, where every little mistake that could possibly, get an officer or a community in trouble, those mistakes are going to be covered up. And it's going to happen with the full participation of all of the officers, in some cases, multiple officers across county, because why not, right? Because we can't just have this all tied to well, they're sharing risk in some cases, right? If these municipalities are coming together and saying, we're going to create our own private insurance fund for these cases, well, now they're willing to work together when it comes to covering things up. So this is not conspiracy. That is what happens today. It just doesn't happen as much because there is so many insurance companies are willing to actually help these guys out. But once it becomes a no longer profitable venture for insurance companies, yeah, they're going to start covering things up, and it's going to get bad. And it won't matter if it's an unarmed black man or or a short Latino woman or this is going to happen across the board. And as I pointed out, many of these cases, many of these settlements that these police departments are paying out are from car crashes, like simple things that you don't think about, or people who are wrongfully imprisoned and they're finally, getting their settlements years after. So expect massive corruption in the future if massive change does not happen to police departments. But I think the financial motivation is going to make things happen sooner than later. Now, I know this is not the justice that many people are looking for, but in this case, I think that justice is coming one way or another, and probably more quickly than you might think. When you have the pressure of the mob on the outside, and then you have the financial pressures of the cities and the city officials and the insurance companies on the inside, and then simply, public outcry, between social media and media coverage. It's just a matter of time. So with that said, I would love to hear what you guys think about this story. I got a bunch of stuff to talk about. Trump was going crazy last night, and I got to talk about it. So stay tuned. More segments coming